It's very clear that by 2050, there'll be three great powers: United States, China, and India. So, some middle powers, clearly like India, will grow and become a great power. Other middle powers, let's say Russia, Brazil, Japan, they're not going to become great powers. But at the same time, the more thoughtful leaders are also preoccupied with the long-term structural challenges happening in the world also. Because clearly, we are seeing the end of the era of Western domination of world history, and we are seeing the return of Asia. And this is obviously going to have profound consequences for the global order. And you got to worry not just about the immediate short-term challenges, but how you adjust to a new long-term global order.
I agree. And I would like to talk about this much more in a minute. I would just like to talk a little bit more about, this point in time. Why do you think that the change that we are all living through right now feels so overwhelming to so many leaders?
I think it's perfectly natural for the leaders to feel overwhelmed because there are too many things happening at the same time. We are living at a time of enormous change. I've only mentioned some of the obvious geopolitical challenges, but there are also challenges posed by technology. AI is probably going to affect the jobs market significantly, and at the same time, many countries around the world are also facing demographic challenges. They're not replacing themselves, especially in Europe and in East Asia. So, it's a combination of all kinds of problems. But I have to quickly also emphasize, and I hope that will be the theme of my remarks, that at the end of the day, I'm an optimist about the future. I believe we are sailing into a better world, even though we have lots to be concerned about.
So what you would say is it's not necessarily a more dangerous world right now, although it feels like this to many, but it's just less familiar because of the transformation we are going through.
I would say in many ways, if you look at it objectively, statistically, the Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker has shown that over a long-term trend, less people are dying in wars than you used to die in wars. There are small blimps now and then, but by and large, the world is in general a much more peaceful place, and the human condition also is improving significantly. And just to give you one obvious example, if you add up the population of the CIA countries, CIA is not Central Intelligence Agency. CIA stands for China, India, ASEAN. China has 1.4 billion people. India has 1.4 billion people. ASEAN has got almost 700 million people. And then you add up 1.4 plus 1.4 plus 700 comes to 3.5 billion people. Now, among these 3.5 billion people, in the year 2000, only 150 million people enjoyed middle-class living standards. But by 2020, that number had exploded 10 times to 1.5 billion. And by 2030, you'll be like 2.5 to 3 billion people enjoying middle-class living standards in Asia. So you can see, therefore, that the human condition overall is improving dramatically in our times.
And I also read the other day that now China and India, I think, account for around 40% of global growth. So it's really remarkable what is happening. I want to talk to you also about, what this actually means for leaders and how to deal with this. What recommendation would you have to leaders on how good judgment actually looks like when there's so much change and so much uncertainty?
Well, I think it would depend on which geographical region you're in as a leader. And for example, if you live in the West, I always encourage every Western leader to understand an important statistic, which is that 12% of the world's population lives in the West and 88% lives outside the West. And often the 12% in the West only talk to each other. and listen to each other and are obsessed with each other's concerns and make no effort to understand how the remaining 88% of the world thinks about what is happening now. And that's a prescription for disaster. So I would encourage Western leaders to make a bigger effort to understand the rest. And as you know, we're seeing the great return of Asia, and certainly they have to understand Asia. Now, but if I was talking to an Asian leaders, and many Asian leaders, as you know, feel very confident and optimistic for the future, I try to tell them, be careful. You've done very well so far, but be prepared for new challenges. Economic growth at the end of the day still requires a lot of hard work, and it can be very challenging. So, depending on which leaders I'm talking to, I would have different kinds of advice to offer.
Makes a lot of sense. So let's take this from the uncertainty to the structural changes that we are seeing underneath all of this that you were already starting to talk about. When we take this frame of a Western leader again, what do you think that the West or Western leaders still misunderstand about Asia's growing role in the world?
Well, I think many Western leaders don't understand the scale of the structural shift that has happened. So, for example, I find it very surprising that many European leaders, they speak very condescendingly about China. Now, you could do that as a European leader in the year 2000, when the combined GNP of the European Union was 8 times bigger than China in the year 2000. Now, the European Union and China are about the same size. By 2050, the European Union will be half the size of China. Now, if you are 8 times bigger than China, maybe you can talk down to China. But when you become half the size of China, you can't talk down to China anymore. I find it very, very puzzling that European leaders don't step back and say, hey, how has the world changed? And how should my language change? How should my concepts change? How should I treat countries differently? Maybe treat them with greater respect, So to me, it's very, very puzzling of this lack of understanding in Europe, of the need for Europe to have a complete strategic reboot. Because as you know, today, sadly, the European continent is probably one of the most pessimistic continents in the world. I mean, they have a very good life on a day-to-day basis, but as they look ahead to the future, very few of them believe that their children will have a better life than them. And they should ask themselves, what are the adjustments they need to make? And one of the adjustments they need to make is to treat the rest of the world more respectfully.
I agree with that. And there are many other adjustments that need to be made. So this is also one of the focus areas that I do a lot of work on, what needs to happen in Europe actually to come back to a growth path. But I would like to talk to you also about Asia a little bit more. So basically you describe what is happening today as a global rebalancing. So what do you exactly mean by this term?
Oh, well, I think one of the examples I give is how there's a relative shift of economic power from the West to the rest. I compared European Union and China already. I'll give you another example. Again, in the year 2000, when the 21st century began, the UK economy was 3.5 times bigger than India. 3.5 times bigger. Today, UK is smaller than India. And by 2050, India will be 4 times bigger than UK. Now, when the United Kingdom is 3.5 times bigger than India, maybe you can give advice, maybe you can say, hey, we can tell you what to do. But when you become 1/4 the size of India, then you got to figure out what you learn from India. And I think it's important for Europeans to understand that they have to make space for, other powers too. And I've suggested, for example, UK should give up its permanent seat on the UN Security Council to India. It's another example of a structural shift that has to take place. So I think these are the sort of fundamental adjustments that we will have to make sometime in the next 10 to 20 years.
Do you think that now it's less, let's say, the West and Asia, but more US and China as the big dominant powers in the world, and then, the rest of the world as middle powers. Does this also is something that you think about, how this changes geopolitics?
Well, I think the middle powers, will play a bigger and bigger role, but the term middle powers is a bit too vague. You have to look at power by power. So, for example, the European Union as a whole should, by the way, in theory, be a great power. Its economy is the same size as China. But just now when you asked your question, you said there are only two great powers, US and China. So European Union should ask itself, why isn't it treated like a great power? It should be the third great power, right? And at the same time, frankly, even though in terms of economic size, India may be a middle power today, it's very clear that by 2050, there'll be three great powers: United States, China, and India. So, some middle powers, clearly like India, will grow and become a great power. Other middle powers, let's say Russia, Brazil, Japan, they're not going to become great powers. So you have to look at it very carefully and look not just at where they stand today, but what their growth prospects are, and also how much strategic wisdom they display. I would say the European Union, sadly, is not displaying much strategic wisdom. Sadly, as a friend of Europe, I say this. But I would say that China and India are displaying a lot more strategic wisdom in how they're adapting and adjusting to the world. So it's not just about size, it's also about acumen and quality of mind of the leaders that are running these countries.
And when we talk about Asia, Asia is one region, but it consists of very different strategic worlds, really. What is the best way for leaders to make sense of this diversity?
You are absolutely right. Asia is very, very diverse. And certainly Chinese civilization is very different from Indian civilization, which is very different from Islamic civilization. So it's important to understand the diversity of Asia. But at the same time, there have also been deep historical links among the different Asian civilizations. And the way I illustrate this is by taking my personal case. I'm, as you know, ethnically an Indian, but I was born as a Hindu Sindhi. Sindh is now part of Pakistan. Now, as a Hindu Sindhi, obviously I have cultural ties with India, but I also have cultural ties with majority of Southeast Asia, because 9 out of the 10 Southeast Asian countries have an Indian base. And at the same time, since I'm ethnically Sindhi, the script that I use to write as a Sindhi is the Arabic script. And my name, Mahbubani, comes from an Arabic or Persian word, Mahbub, which means beloved. So I, as a Hindu Sindhi, have a connection with Hindus, and I have a connection with Muslims. But at the same time, I also have a connection with the Buddhists in Japan, in South Korea, in China, because Buddhism came from India. So you can see, therefore, if I, as one human being, can have cultural affiliations with the Islamic world in West Asia, with the Hindus in South Asia, with the Buddhists in Northeast Asia, you can see, therefore, that there were traditional links and connections among Asia. They were cut off by 200 years of Western colonial rule, but are now coming back again. So Asia, yes, Asia is diverse, but Asia also has traditional links with each other.
And from a geostrategic perspective, India has quite different objectives than China, than ASEAN, than Japan, for example. So how do you make sense of this in terms of the diversity of interests?
Well, I think India, for sure, as I mentioned earlier, is going to emerge as the third independent pole in the world. It'll be really a multipolar world with three great powers: US, China, and India. India till today is, of course, still much smaller than US or China, but its potential for growth is very real. And the best position for India to be in, let's say with US and China, if you can imagine there's a seesaw. And, on the seesaw, on one side, you have the Chinese elephant. On the other side, you have the American elephant. The best place for India to position itself is to be on the middle of the seesaw. And so wherever India puts its foot, the seesaw goes up and down. So India can play a more effective role if it has equally close ties with both US and China. And I think in the long run, that's where India will drift towards going to.
And if you could summarize in one sentence what you wish leaders would remember about Asia, what would it be?
Well, I think in one sentence, please remember that from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. So the return of China and India is a perfectly natural development.
And what mindset change do you think can help leaders act on this insight?
Well, I think it's very important for Western leaders to travel to Asia and to understand the longer arc of Asian history. So, for example, if you want to understand China, don't just try to understand the Chinese Communist Party, because the Chinese Communist Party has only been around about 80 years or so. But Chinese civilization has been around for at least 4,000 years. And if you don't understand the longer arc of Chinese history, you cannot understand contemporary China.
And you already briefly mentioned some things about your own journey. I would like to also talk a little bit about how deeply tied your own path through diplomacy and global leadership is to your ideas that you have about Asia and the West and geopolitics in general. So you spent decades inside global institutions, among which the UN. What did that experience teach you about the world and how it really works?
Well, you're absolutely right. Personal experience matters a lot. And my years in the United Nations, 10 years as ambassador to UN, certainly made a difference. But equally importantly, I want to emphasize at the outset that I have the great advantage of living through many historical eras. So, for example, very few people today have experienced life as a colonial subject. So when I was born and brought up in Singapore, until the age of 15, Singapore was a British colony. And when I grew up as an Asian in a British colony, I believe that I, as a brown man, I was intellectually, culturally inferior to the white man. Now, I emphasize this point because I have lived through periods when Asians were very, very depressed and saw no hope for the future. So I've come from a time when there was deep pessimism in Asia to now living in a time where there's great optimism in Asia. And that experience has shaped my views and thinking dramatically because I can see how much the world has changed. And I say this not on the basis of reading books, on the basis of personal experience of living through colonial rule. And at the same time, I would say certainly my 10 and a half years as ambassador to UN, especially the 2 years in the UN Security Council, taught me a lot. Because as I say in my memoirs, Living the Asian Century, that the 2 years in the UN Security Council taught me that whenever there's a clash between power and principle, power always wins. Principle dies. So power is the dominant force driving global geopolitics. And so we should have no illusions about what drives human history.